Hello and welcome back, dear participants of Anocracy 2020. We are slowly heading towards the end of this conference, and I'm wondering if you, the audience, find it good or rather awkward that we planned a conference on the future of democracy a few days before the US presidential elections without having a session specifically on the US. I'm pretty sure that there are good arguments for both viewpoints. However, we, the Anocracy team, just changed our minds 1 week ago and decided to try the seemingly impossible and talk about the US and the democracy in the US from a rather future-oriented and long-term perspective. So what you will see now is a pre-recorded session which you will hear with Diego Rivas, who is chair of Democrats Abroad in Berlin and who was a delegate to Bernie Sanders. He also works in the International Dialogue Program at das Progressive Zentrum. Diego will be interviewing Martina Guzmán, who is a Damon J. Cave Center for Civil Rights, Race and Justice Journalism Fellow at the Kane State University, and she's based in Detroit. Please enjoy this conversation, and we will see you back here for breakout groups and then the reflection.
Hi, my name is Diego Rivas. I am chair of Democrats Abroad Berlin, and also I work at das Progressive Zentrum, which is a think tank based here in Berlin, Germany. So that's where I am calling from tonight. And yeah, we are with Martina Guzmán, who is a Race and Justice Journalism Fellow at the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights at the Law University at Wayne State University in Michigan. So Martina, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have you and have an insight from the US, about the US. And yeah, it's great that you're here.
Thank you, Diego. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to talk about these really important issues and sort of really give a nod to the kind of conversations you guys are having right now. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's just jump right on in. So we are at Anocracy. And Anocracy is about bringing the future back to democracy. And what we mean by that is, this whole week during this whole conference, we have really been trying to paint bold visions of the future that enable us really to address the challenges that we are currently facing. This is not just an exercise in thinking or philosophizing, but we really believe that what's so important is that we understand where we're heading and where we want to head, different visions of society, of how we want to have it. And only once we have these clear, bold visions, then we can truly start addressing our problems. Of course, if we're talking about future democracies, future visions, with the election next week in the United States, we pretty much, to address the elephant in the room, need to talk about the US. So for that, we definitely are super happy to have Martina Guzmán with us. And yeah, that brings me to a first question, which is, we know you work in journalism, you are a journalist, you engage a lot with communities, and you really have this important perspective that people have their everyday lives, their economic lives, their social lives, their personal lives. And when we're talking about futures, we also really want to bring these ideas in. And so our first question for you is, if you could really talk to these people who maybe you engage with articles or your reports and your reporting, and if you were to ask them, what is their personal future vision of Detroit or the areas that they live in for 2035, what do you think they would say?
Well, I think it varies, right? Depending on the age group in which you ask. I think that there is a group of people here in Michigan who are, what they call millennials here in the United States. And, who's, for example, people that I know whose grandparents came as immigrants to this country, whose parents were born here, whose parents went and got an education, a 4-year degree at an institution, but yet the child of that person now lives at home, can't get a secondary education because they can't afford it, doesn't have real prospects for a job because the economy doesn't allow it. And you have people sort of navigating a future that's incredibly uncertain for them, that their lives are not better than their parents or their grandparents. And that's incredibly realistic for a lot of people, not just in Detroit, but across the United States. When you shift in terms of color and you start talking about that same experience for Black people, right? Detroit is a Black city, right? It is more than 80% Black. And it has a long history of, social and economic uprisings, of political being the first place where many politicians in the city, like having first Black mayors, circuit court judges, having like a Black intelligentsia, having Black intellectuals, and that kind of Black society sort of permeating not just Detroit, but the United States. They come from a different perspective of what the future is. And I'll give you one example. If you're talking to, there is a big Black farming movement here in Michigan, here in Detroit specifically. And I know that a lot of Black people from Detroit are often go to places pre-pandemic all over the world to talk about farming and Black farming and why it's so important, right? And they can talk about it in terms of democracy, and they can talk about how food sovereignty is critical to ownership and to ownership of their own future, to say. And the problems with that is that, like other people who have farms, they don't own their own land. And if you were to ask a Black farmer in Detroit, what does the future look like for you? For a millennial, it may look like, I just want the basic opportunity to be able to live independently, get a college education, and have a career. For an African-American farmer, it's a little different. What that person wants is the ability to own land, right? Something as basic as that they don't see in their future, right? Or haven't seen, but want to see and are going about doing things in order to make that happen. And I'll give you an example. Recently, a collective of Black farmers got together and decided that because they couldn't own land, or that it was difficult to own land, they began a fundraiser and created a fundraiser on social media in the way that many people do for, projects and, art projects or whatever it is that you want to do to fundraise, excuse me. And so they decided to do that, and it went incredibly well. It was incredibly successful, right? That people believed in what they were doing so much that their desire for sovereignty and democracy and ownership of their own future was so important to them that people gave money for them to buy land in the city of Detroit. And that's something that I think a lot of people would call radical, right? To crowdfund so that you can own your own land. That's something that's very progressive, and to do it as a collective community, right? Not as individuals, but as a community come together to do that. And so this is the kind of thinking that's happening in Detroit in order for people to say, I need to have a certain kind of future. And if I'm not getting that future from my government or from city government, then I need to do it independently on my own. And these are the kinds of steps that people are taking to do that.
Yeah. And just a quick follow-up question. Sure. I mean, I think that's a great example. Do you think that it's more out of necessity? Do you think that they really want to do it on their own because they see that's the only way forward? Or do you think that they could imagine a future where if a government actually worked for them and their communities as well, where that would maybe be a more desirable way to go forward with that?
Yeah, I think that they feel that is their only way forward. I think they feel that city government has abandoned them. I think they feel that federal and state government has abandoned them. And I'll give you an example. In Detroit right now, there is a massive foreclosure crisis, right? So that if you are not allowed to have the finances to pay the taxes on your own home, right? The city government comes in and takes it, right? And for many people in Detroit, people have been living in these homes for generations. You have people that are in their 70s and 80s who that home, that house on that block was their future to multi-generational wealth, even if it was small. That was a house payment that they no longer had to make. That was something that they could ultimately leave to their children and to their grandchildren, who they wouldn't have to make a house payment, right? And now that is eroded. That has been completely erased because of the foreclosure crisis. So when you have institutions failing people in that way, that the foreclosure crisis can be prevented. It can be stopped, but it isn't stopped. It continues to happen. Right now, there's a moratorium on it, right, on the foreclosure crisis. But in the process, thousands and thousands of African Americans have lost their homes because of this crisis that could have been preventable. And there have been lawsuits and there have been coalitions of people who have come together, right? But it has failed. It has failed Black Detroiters.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Also, really good example. I think it really illustrates not only what's happening, as you said at the beginning, in Detroit or in Michigan, but I believe we're also seeing this pattern of essentially consequences of the foreclosure crisis happening across the United States. And definitely, I'm sure that many people and many communities would be feeling very similarly and also wanting to do other forms of change. So I think that this really is an important issue to address. And we heard some solutions here as well. I kind of want to take a step back
Sure.
and take a quick little shift. And, you work as a journalist. And I think right now, when we're looking at the current challenges that we're facing in the United States, obviously a huge issue is the future of media, the media landscape. Where is that going? And yeah, I would be really curious to hear what your thoughts are actually about how could a positive and influential and efficient, or just all around well-working media landscape in 2035 could look like.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny, Diego. I spend an enormous amount of time thinking about sort of the future of journalism. And even though I think about it sort of in a micro, sort of from a micro perspective, I know people sit around and think about it nationally. I think about it in terms of what's happening in a city like Detroit, a Black city, or a city that has a multi-ethnic population. And I think that one of the things that I come back to over and over again is representative democracy, right? And this is a problem in the United States. How we represent people of color, Black people, Latino people, Native American people in the media is critical to its growth. It's critical to its strength. It's critical to it being a pillar of democracy in the United States. And we are still so far from that no matter how many conversations we've been having lately about what newsroom looks like, we are still so far from being there that I actually think it is going to take until 2035 for us to get into the space where we need to be. There's also other factors, right? Right now, I think there needs to be an aggressive push on behalf of journalistic institutions to build trust with the communities they serve, right? They need to build trust with Black communities, with Latino communities, with communities who have not seen themselves reflected properly on those pages, or on media itself for a very long time. And it seems basic, but it's actually challenging. And the reason it's challenging is because the structure of media itself at its core is, there's racism embedded in these institutions, right? Yeah. It's not just like individuals going, hey, why don't you hire people of color? Because the entire institution is designed so that people of color, A, aren't hired, or B, often don't feel welcome there. So in order to change the institution, that's like years of work, that's years of self-reflection, that's years of making a difference in terms of how do you break that down? And what you see in Detroit is you see institutions going, I can't wait for that to happen. That's taking too long. I've been waiting for journalism to do the right thing. I've been waiting for journalism to build trust and to be representative, and it's not happening. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to build my own media outlet, right? And I'm going to have it reflect what I want, right? I'm going to hire the journalists that I want. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a media outlet that's sort of kind of open to much fanfare here in Detroit, and it's called Bridge Detroit 313, Bridge Detroit. And they opened with an all-Black newsroom. And in a city like Detroit, when all of the newsrooms are majority white, to have an all-Black, well-funded, with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, high-level reporters working in the newsroom, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. That's them saying that doesn't work for us anymore. So we're going to do it our way. And that's our way of being representative. That's our way of holding up democracy. That's a way of holding up these pillars and building trust with the Black community, right? I can go on, but please ask me anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be personally really excited to hear another example, because I think so much of what we're trying to vision is exactly, case studies or real life examples of this Black newsroom in Detroit, because definitely we all know that the demographics of the United States are not well reflected in many of the most important pillars of our democracy, newsrooms being one of them. And I think it would be great to hear another example if you have one.
Sure, absolutely. So there was another outlet in Chicago, right? For example, that it was a group of young millennials, right? That set out, that had the kind of burnout, right? That I experienced and a lot of journalists of color experience when you're in an all-white newsroom, right? Where you're constantly fighting for stories like, hey, why don't we tell a story about, the Arabic community? Or why don't we tell a story about, Black people in this way? Or why don't we cover issues that always aren't about immigration or Black shootings or, mass incarceration, but that actually tell a reflective, comprehensive look at a community, right? So they got tired and they got burned out and they decided that they wanted to build their own, newsroom. And what they did was they started out small and they built this newsroom on the premise that every single journalist that worked for them had to be embedded in one of Chicago's communities, right? For 6 weeks. And within those 6 weeks, you had to find out who the community leaders were, right? What was the history of that community, right? Was it a community in transition that used to be white, but now it's Black? Or was it an immigrant community that's now, being gentrified and white people are moving in? What's the history of it? What are the issues, right? Is garbage an issue? Are shootings an issue? Is, what's happening in that community in order for you to report on it? For 6 weeks, that reporter has to be embedded, right? And they have to find out everything. And only then, after all of that has happened, can then that journalist come back and begin to write stories about it, right?
Yeah.
And so that is a way of people getting to know the journalist, right? People being able to build sources so that you can tell really good stories, building trust with a community that, doesn't have trust with journalists or government or anyone else, and telling really damn good stories and, making good news. And doing good journalism, which is what your job is. And so this was the methodology that they took, and that it's been an incredibly successful model, right? So that's another example. And I could go on and on about how like sort of women are opening up their own media outlets as well. And there's multiple examples of people saying, I can't wait for you to change your ways. I want to see democracy done right, so I'm going to do it on my own. And what's fascinating is that it's the communities of color here in the United States that are doing it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, another great example. And I think what's so interesting about that, because, when we're thinking about community engagement, as well as having more representative newsrooms of our communities, the first thing we think of is, okay, let's hire the Latina, let's hire the African American. And then often, many of us, share this experience. Then we are forced, whether we are a woman, to then write about women's issues, or from the African American community, maybe about African American Black issues. And of course, like you're very well illustrating, what can be so frustrating about that is, of course, there's so many more sides to us. We all have many identities, and the color of our skin or how we identify is just one of them. And I think hearing these examples and really having them illustrate that, it's all about not only writing damn good stories, but then also reflecting the community and being embedded, I think is exactly the right way for this idea of representation.
Right. And Diego, you have to understand, we're battling a serious trust issue. And I don't say trust in as a word that's sort of used flippantly. I mean, in America, people are attacking journalists because they don't trust them, because we live in a culture where journalists are being attacked. That is the extreme model, right? That is the extreme point of view where that's happening. These are the kinds of things that you would have never expected to see in a country like the United States. These are the attacking journalists was something that you thought happened in developing countries or in anti-democratic countries, right? They jailed them, they imprisoned them, for writing stories. But that's happening here. And that's happening every day, because who you are, whether you're a white manufacturing older white worker in the United States and you don't trust journalists, or you're a young Black man or a young Black woman in the inner city of Detroit and you don't trust journalists either. So building trust with a community is essential. It's critical to our progress as news people and to, again, sustaining this pillar of democracy in America.
Yeah. And excellent. I think it's super interesting. And I think there's a lot of excellent case studies that we're talking about. Staying on this point, because I don't really want to move away quite yet.
Sure.
How could you envision maybe this type of relationship between the community and the journalist in the future? I mean, of course, we want to start now. Like we've been saying, this is not about let's just do it in 15 years. But ideally, how should this be? You had the idea, or you gave the example of being embedded in the community. But how else could this look like?
So one of the projects that I'm working on here in Detroit, my work at the Keith Center as a journalism fellow, is exactly this, right? So what I'm doing is again, I have found myself in a position where going, I can't change the hiring practices of, all of these different media outlets in the city of Detroit. I don't know how to do that. I don't have the power to do that. But what I can do is build an ecosystem, right? I can build an ecosystem that supports newsrooms in getting the voices of journalists of color onto their pages and onto their websites, right? So what I've been doing is cultivating journalists of color, right? Freelance journalists who don't work in newsrooms. And they don't work in newsrooms because newsrooms aren't hiring, because, they're shrinking. As you know, in the United States, there's a crisis that all of these media outlets have closed because there's no financing in which for them to go on and continue. And so they find themselves out there wanting to be writers, wanting to be journalists, wanting to tell the stories in their communities, good, rich stories, but they don't have access into sort of getting them into the media outlets. So what I've done is, I'll give you an example. I created an event last year where I invited, I think it was 10 editors, roughly 10 editors from all of the local media outlets. And I invited all of these journalists of color, freelancers. And in an intimate setting, there were 30 people. 30 journalists of color showed up to meet face-to-face editors and to say, this is my name, this is who I am, and I would like to write for you. And the editors got to introduce themselves one-on-one, meet them face-to-face, and saying, I'm the editor of such outlet, and these are the kinds of stories that I'm looking for. Since then, multiple people from that night have gone on to be regular contributors to the media outlets in Detroit, right? And, Arab American journalists, Bengali journalists, Black journalists, photographers, multimedia journalists telling stories and working with editors that they may have not normally gotten to know had it not been for an event like this. So creating a really strong ecosystem is what I find to be working right now, is working with independent journalists. That might not be the answer for other cities and other places, but right now in Detroit, this is the answer for us, right? And slowly influencing startups. In Detroit, we are lucky enough to have a real sort of intellectual community where in the past, I would say 4 years, 4 new media startups have started, right? And one is focused completely on the environment. One is focused on investigative work. 2 are focused on community reporting, right? One is focused on food and culture. And, all of them have done the same thing, started because of a need, that something was missing and they wanted to do better. So working with those startups and making sure that they're connected to the journalists of color has really helped influence how and who they cover. And as a result, they're doing incredibly well, but they also started from a position of believing fundamentally that having journalists of color was important, right? So they're not kind of having to change how they think, which is the problem with older newsrooms, right? Is how do I get you to change how you think? These new innovators don't have that. They're already coming from that perspective going, things are wrong, and I want to walk into it doing good work and hiring the right people. And so that's what's happening. And it's actually quite exciting because you see like a lot of innovation and a lot of incredible stories coming out in Detroit that I think had it not been for this new culture emerging, just wouldn't be happening.
Yeah. Yeah, great. I mean, I think, once again, super great to hear. And I think for me, I grew up in California, in the Central Valley. And when I go back home now, I open up the local newspaper and, actually it's about 10 pages long and 7 pages are ads. And there's not that much information, but I know how important it is actually that there is an ecosystem a local source of, people in the community reporting on what's happening, because that's daily life for so many people. I think we could go, down this path of not only what's the future of inclusive journalism, but generally speaking, how could it be funded? But unfortunately, we don't have time for that. So using this idea of maybe, a lot of local journalism is unfortunately not being funded, or being threatened to go away, or having a lot of its own issues. And I think some of the examples you just gave is actually about building back better. So it's coming back, having new types of journalism, and having it even better and more inclusive from day one, not just rethinking. But with the slogan building back better, and for the last 5 or 6 minutes of our time, I do want to open it up a little bit to the current US election, Joe Biden. And yeah, I'd be really curious to hear your vision of, what could be a common unifying vision that could replace Trump, whether that's next week or in 4 years. What type of vision could replace Trump and the current Republican Party when they are no longer in power? Maybe something that's unifying, that has enough energy to actually bring people together to do something, instead of just fighting against Trump.
Well, I think from the perspective of journalism, the one thing I will start with is that I think that if Joe Biden wins, there will be a president in office who doesn't attack the media and doesn't attack journalists, and sees the importance of journalism in a democracy. That's one. Two, I don't think that Donald Trump or any of his family members are going anywhere. If they lose, I think that they will be incredibly present in American politics, and they will continue to sort of fuel the division that exists. And I think that there are enough people that stand behind and fundamentally believe what Donald Trump believes, in terms of sort of a xenophobic, kind of predominantly white, nostalgic for some past that never really existed, where, white America is the dominant culture, where they will continue to push for that. They will continue to want it. And I think Donald Trump will, unlike other presidents who have sort of left the presidency and gone on to do other things and sort of stayed quietly in the background, that is not what's going to happen with this president. I don't see that at all. And I see it incredibly challenging for Joe Biden, if he does win, to sort of unite an America that is so deeply divided that it's going to take more than sort of 4 years or 8 years of a Joe Biden presidency to do that. I think the GOP, and with their handling of the Supreme Court, have angered a lot of people. I think that they have made their base happy, but their base is shrinking. And I think they've made a lot of other people angry, to the point where even those people are willing to sort of fudge or to really challenge the Constitution in order for them to say, okay, it's fair now. And that means opening up the court to more Supreme Court justices is one of the ways in which that might happen. But no, I think that November 3rd will come and go, Diego, honestly, and it will just be the beginning of many, many possibly lawsuits. And it won't be over on November 3rd. That's what I'll tell you.
Yeah, I'm feeling the same way here. We're organizing in Berlin, but we're in it for the long run. And yeah, I mean, a quick follow-up maybe just in the last couple of minutes we have, though. Do you think, though, that there is maybe an idea like the Green New Deal, or maybe statehood for Washington, D.C., or, reforming the Electoral College? Is there an overarching vision that could really bring not only the progressive and the moderate wing of the Democratic Party together for something instead of against Trump, but do you see anything like this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the Green New Deal, if it produces jobs, especially, right? That's the thing. I mean, that's the big divider in America. It's like sort of this base of people who felt like they could go to work every day, have a pension, have a job, belong to a union, and maybe pass that job on to, their son or their daughter, and sort of have a certain kind of lifestyle. And if the Green New Deal can build jobs and build that economic base again for the middle class of America, then I think that Joe Biden and his administration, if they do win, could hit a home run, right? That no matter whether people believe that, climate change is real or not, if they have a job to go to every day that pays them a decent living wage, that person's going to be happy, and that person's going to buy into sort of a philosophy of building a new green economy, because it supports them and it supports their families. And ultimately, that's what America is fighting for. It is at its core, how is your family doing every single day, right? How is your family surviving and living? And do you have money in your bank account, or are you $500 away from being completely bankrupt, which many people in America are? Yeah. So I think philosophies like that have really taken root, absolutely. And some will have more success than others. The Green New Deal, as opposed to changing the Electoral College, I think is going to be a lot more popular.
Yeah. Excellent. So I think we'll end on that note. I mean, I think we could go on and on. There's so many other topics we could get into that I would love to talk to you about, especially in this transatlantic setting. I think it's super important to have this exchange with people who are working in the communities over there on the other side of the pond. And then here on the continent, many people are as well. And I'm sure the past couple of days, we heard a lot of interesting perspectives on future visions, and as well as how we can effectively and really in an excellent forward-thinking way transform our democratic systems. So Martina Guzmán, thank you so much. Really nice talking to you. And
absolutely, it was a pleasure.
Hi, and welcome back after this conversation between Diego Rivas and Martina Guzmán. Even though the session was pre-recorded, I would like to warmly thank Martina for taking the time to go into this important discussion at Democracy 2020. What I learned from this discussion or this conversation, and one of the things is that because of a lack of trust in institutions and governments, a somewhat do-it-yourself spirit has evolved in Detroit. We will send you now into breakout groups with 3 other people, and you will have time for about 15 minutes to talk about whether you could relate to what you just heard in this conversation or not, and why. And we would like to ask you if what you heard made you change your mind of looking at the future and having a future perspective. After that breakout group, we will be back here in the live stream for a reflection with Emily Schultheis and Andrea Römmele, and this reflection will be hosted by Diego Rivas. Now enjoy the breakout groups and see you back there.
Hi, welcome back from the breakout sessions. I hope you had a great conversation on this really current, pertinent topic. Now we'll be moving into the reflection session, and I'm very excited to announce our 2 speakers for this session. First, we have Professor Andrea Römmele, who is Dean of Executive Education and Professor of Communication and Civil Society at the Hertie School of Governance. Also with us tonight, we have Emily Schultheis, who is a freelance journalist and a fellow with the Institute of Current World Affairs. So just to jump right into it, I'm sure we have a lot to talk about and reflect upon. During the session, we really talked a lot about communities and the importance of having strong pillars of democracy, such as journalism, more embedded in the communities that they really engage with. So Emily, Andrea, what would a community-based future in the United States really look like? The floor is yours.
All right, I guess I will jump in and start specifically talking about the journalism aspect. I think when it comes to trust in institutions, be it journalism, be it local, state, national government, so much of this has to do with, as Martina said, this idea that you believe the people who are involved, be it as an elected official or as a journalist, know something about your community, knows something about what your community needs, knows about the problems of your community, and is actively listening to and trying to do something to change them. And, I think that I think being able to have that either personal or at the very least closer contact to some of these institutions would be massively helpful. So, I mean, when we talk about the media, for example, it's very often said that, you know, people talk about not trusting the media broadly, or Trump saying, for example, that the media more broadly is fake news out to get him, etc. And I think, you know, if you were to present people with local organizations that really truly do know what's going on in their communities, or for example, national organizations, oftentimes which are based in New York or DC, recognizing that it makes a lot of sense to have people based in specific states, in specific communities, not just traveling there for a few days when a candidate is in town. You know, if we were then having a discussion about, do you trust the media, maybe you still are a little bit wary of certain things, but you know that the Washington Post has a reporter who's based in your town, who's writing really good stuff about what's happening in your community. Maybe it's that you know that there's, you know, one of these new startups that Martina mentioned that is embedded in a community. And I think all of those, I think those things, this idea that, you know, maybe you don't necessarily, or maybe you still are skeptical about an institution more broadly, but you have some sort of personal contact with it on a local level, and that might help to at least somewhat reduce these issues of trust in bigger, broader, sort of amorphous institutions like the media or the government.
Yeah, if I can just add on to that. I mean, what we know from democratic theories is that the level of trust, or trust in institutions, put it this way, trust in institutions needs to be rebuilt, and it is best rebuilt if we start from the quote unquote bottom, you know, start with communities, also start with cities, because that's where people, you know, people know each other, people know the institutions there, and it's easier for them to build up trust again. And I think that's something that has really suffered a lot over the last couple of years. What I really liked about the discussion we just saw is that civil society actually actively tries to rebuild trust, which is a great thing if that happens on the local level. But I think one has to also ask the question, if we have these different communities all country, what actually connects the communities? And I think that's a really crucial part, because the communities shouldn't be sort of single bubbles, but there should be something connecting them, and that is really crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I found that really interesting about what Martina said as well, this idea of sort of, you know, we as a community, or we as a group within a community see something that's very clearly not functioning well. It's not being taken care of on a government level. Maybe the media is not paying attention to it as well. So we're going to just go ahead and do something. And so, you know, I think the ideal situation would be where newly elected government leaders, be it on the local, state, or national level, learn from those things that are being done, help, you know, maybe be a partner in making it easier for people to continue those sorts of initiatives.
Yeah, I think that's important, but I think what's important, if we analyze that, going back to what Martina said in her analysis, is that she describes sort of the activity on the community level, the community building is done because people are dissatisfied with government. Now, wouldn't it be fantastic in an ideal world, and we are also talking a little bit about, you know, what the ideal world could look like, if communities actually would get active and trust the government? Do they only become active triggered by the distrust in government? That was sort of my question when I was listening to the talk.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good, it's probably a bit of both, right? I mean, I think if we want to talk about sort of entrepreneurial spirit in the US, I think that is kind of a big part of the character of the country.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, there's always been instances where, you know, you want something done, you decide you're going to go out and do it yourself. But I do think in these last couple of years especially, and not just the Trump years, but, you know, recent decades even, as some of these problems have become very ingrained in society, yeah, I think that's probably happening more because of that lack of trust as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the other thing on this front that I would say in terms of trust, and I kind of just mentioned this, but I do think that a lot of it goes, whether trust in the media or trust in government, it goes back so much further than November 2016. When we talk about the media, I mean, Martina mentioned this, and some of the, in her discussions of some of these new startups that are being created in cities like Detroit. But I mean, the local media scene in the last, I don't know, maybe 20 years, I would say, has just been completely decimated to a point that, I think that it probably wasn't until 2016 where you started to see the level of intense polarization that we have now, that you realized quite how crucial that was to having a functioning society. And so, I mean, some of it, yes, is about national news organizations saying we need to put our reporters where people are rather than having them based in a place that's very different. But some of it is building back up those kinds of organizations.
Yeah, because, the reporters and journalists back, a couple of years ago were only, quote unquote, based, in New York, Washington, Los Angeles, San Francisco, but not where most of the people actually really. That is, by the way, also a phenomenon we also see in Germany, that journalism goes local again. And that's what people want to hear. That's also, a contribution to building up trust again.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, and that's not something that's going to happen overnight, of course, but to start at least recognizing, yeah.
Yeah, what I also in Martina's discussion found interesting, that she very often mentioned, we're not a representative democracy, we're not representative, and that goes back, and I would be interested in your take, because you, of course, follow the American discussion probably even more closely than I do. I mean, if we talk about the lack of representativeness, we actually also talk about the electoral system. Do you see any chance, Emily, that this discussion might be taken up after the election? Because there has been some discourse about this. I mean, there's always been discourse about this, but I felt over the last couple of months in the campaign that really has built up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, take the Supreme Court, for example. We now have 9 justices, the majority of whom were appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote, and the most recent ones were confirmed by a Senate that received collectively, I don't know how many millions, but many millions fewer votes than the senators who voted against confirming the most recent 3 justices. And so, I think that I do think that it's come into starker focus now after 2016, and because of that Supreme Court fight, than it had been in recent years. But I mean, 2000, that was 20 years ago, and this was also a situation where a Republican won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. So it's clear that this is kind of a structural problem it's not new, and it's certainly not going away. I do think, I mean, so after the 2012 campaign, I remember there being quite a few discussions about the national popular vote movement, and the idea that all states would agree to give their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. The problem is that in a lot of the states, there are good reasons for certain states to resist that, and it makes it very complicated to really do enough that it's effective.
Yeah, but I'm not only talking about the Electoral College and the popular vote and the Electoral College. I'm also thinking whether at some point the US will start a discussion on moving from an electoral system that is based on a majority vote to a system, or an electoral system that's based on proportional representation, because that's you're much closer to representative democracy, what Martina alluded to in her discussion a couple of times, than you are with a system where the winner takes all.
Yeah,
Because
I mean,
basically you have
yeah.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Sorry, Emily.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I think that would be great. You know, I've lived in Germany now for 3.5 years. I think the fact that, you know, if you were to look at the Republican Party of today and split it up into multiple different parties, you know, you would have same with the Democratic Party. You would have a multi-party landscape that could, you know, compete in a more, as you say, representative way. I just have a really hard time believing that level of structural change
that will happen. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things. I mean, there are benefits to our constitution and our democracy, but
you know, so
yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's, and I do think that it is good and helpful to think about ways that at least could move in that direction, right? I just think I think the U.S. is unfortunately hindered by how difficult it is to change some of these things, and that doesn't mean it can't be done. It just does mean that there's, I think, a lot of reason why these discussions have not, unfortunately, led to action in the past.
Yeah, yeah.
But maybe we've reached a tipping point. I'm not sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the other things to mention on this front when we talk about representation, I mean, efforts to restrict voting rights have come obviously specifically and entirely from one political party, right? And it's a political party that recognizes that it's, as Martina sort of mentioned a little bit as well, that the electorate is very much a shrinking one, and the Democrats' electorate is very much a growing one.
A growing
and
one.
I mean, that's been the case for a long time. And I think, you know, after 2012, Republicans were eager to try and figure out how they might be able to move forward. And then Trump happened and took them, you know, 10 steps backward. I don't know how they as a party sort of adjust themselves to the new multicultural reality, but they're going to have to, or otherwise eventually at some point, even under the current system, it's not going to work anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully agree.
And what else? I mean, you know, what kinds of, depending on what happens next week, which obviously, you know, that plays a big role in sort of how these discussions go going forward. But I mean, what kinds of changes do you think would be worth seeing on the electoral level?
I mean, it's going to be interesting to observe the Republicans after the election. I mean, if we look at the numbers now, it looks like I mean, we still are. It's strange, you know. I'm an empirical researcher. I really trust the numbers. And after 2016, I'm so anxious to trust the numbers that I'm still kind of frantic. You know, that Trump will win on Tuesday, but it really looks like he won't, and it will be, I wouldn't say a complete, I don't see like a big wave yet, but it looks clear today that Biden will win. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how the Republicans will react. And there's been a lot of talk about sort of, you know, have your eyes on what happens the 2 weeks after riots in the streets and so on. This might happen. You will know more about this, Emily, than I do. But observing the Republicans, my take is, you know, the Republicans have been a very, how do you say that? A very opportunistic party, right? They saw in 2016, yes, Trump will help us. And now in 2020, they see Trump really harms us, right? So if the votes are cast on election day on Tuesday, probably most of Republicans will turn away from Trump and will try to rebuild, and they have to, you know, really rebuild the Republican Party for a very long time.
I am slightly less optimistic about that, although I think, I think you're right? I think that they're looking at 2016, it was Paul Ryan, then Speaker of the House, was like, this guy's going to get me my tax plan. Mitch McConnell said, this is going to get us our Supreme Court seats. And yeah, I mean, the opportunism in there was, I think, has played out exactly as they probably would have wanted over the course of these last few years, minus a few sort of crazy tweets in between. I guess what I have been a bit surprised by is the extent to which many of the sort of establishment type Republicans, not the Trumpian type Republicans, have been willing to completely back up Trump's claims about voter fraud and about election insecurity. And so that's the only thing that gives me pause. I do think that if Trump were to lose and if Republicans were to lose the Senate, as at this point it seems likely that they could,
yes.
But I also have kind of PTSD from 2016 to make broad predictions. Like the Friday before last year's election, I was sitting on a different panel with a different group of people talking about what a Clinton administration was going to do. So, so we'll see, right?
Same here.
It's gosh, what a crazy 4 years it's been. But I do think if it's clear that they have lost the White House and the Senate, then you will see some of those Republicans breaking ranks and starting to try and forge some sort of new path. It's just hard because Trump has become, the party has become so much about him that I don't know how they think about sort of a new vision forward, at least in the short term.
Yeah, but also the Democrats. I mean, even if Biden wins the presidency, they are also in a complete transition. I mean, what really? I mean, looking back now into 2016, and also now looking back to the election 2020, although it's not over yet. Both times in 2016 and 2020, the Democrats actually picked weak candidates. Weak in the sense of not the right candidates for the time. I'm not saying that Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden are weak politicians, but they're not the best. They weren't the best candidates for that time. I mean, Biden clearly is a transition candidate. The party transitions or has to transition into a new era. And 2016, we all know that history.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty interesting that. At least from, I wasn't personally in the early states this year, but from friends who were there and from reports that I had read, the idea that the Democratic electorate was so focused on who is going to beat Trump and not who do I personally like.
Exactly.
And that's why this happens so quickly for Biden. And so, I mean, but I think Biden is also, I think he recognizes that. And so the space for.
And basically, I always say, and basically I always say, actually there are three choices in the election. It's you vote for Trump, you vote for Biden, or you vote against Trump. And I think the majority of the Democratic, or I wouldn't say the majority, but a huge chunk of the Democratic vote is a vote against Trump, which is not automatically a vote for Biden.
No. And that's what, I mean, I think, what Biden does with that, what he does with, Kamala Harris and his administration, who he chooses for his cabinet, if he puts people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in leading positions and gives them actually the ability to help craft policy, then maybe that, maybe some of the people who are truly only voting against Trump and not for Biden will remain in the fold going forward.
I'm going to jump in, actually. I almost don't want to. It's just a great back and forth, so it's been really great listening to. One thing that I realized is that a lot of what we're talking about, that's an underlying issue, which is maybe a buzzword, but I think important to talk about, which is polarization. And I think it's so difficult to pass a lot of laws, or what we really need is maybe to have institutional reform in order to then have a more representative democracy. So at the beginning of this reflection, we're talking about representation, but we need reform to make that happen. Maybe voting reform, electoral college reform, but the polarization is stopping us. How would you envision a world, or a United States rather, that is less polarized and where it's really a political system where it can pass the necessary reform that we need?
I mean, it's always difficult these reforms need to be passed by politicians who actually benefited from the system because they were voted into office through the system. So that's a really hard one. I think you have to have I mean, we were talking at the very beginning of our discussion, we were talking about the different communities, and that it's great if we have communities that are based on trust. But I think what's also important that these communities are connected. There has to be sort of an overarching vision. In sort of the modern word would be, or the buzzword would be, sort of a national narrative that unites the people. And it is also a leadership task, I think, with a strong, and I hate to use that word, but I think in this context it fits, with a strong charismatic leadership. I think this is possible. Now, how do you overcome polarization through institutional reforms, and how that might happen, I just said, but you of course also to some extent overcome polarization with aiming at closing the gap between the so poor and the so rich, which is incredible, and which COVID actually fosters even more. Introducing a welfare system, introducing a proper healthcare system, and so on, is definitely something that would help overcome this incredible polarization. But I do think institutional reforms are absolutely necessary, because people have to feel represented.
I think, so to sort of to follow up on that, I mean, when we talk about national unity, when we talk about, pulling together and overcoming differences, in a lot of countries where a COVID response was handled, proficiently and well, you actually did see this idea that, a pandemic, which of course none of us anticipated and no one was prepared for, that was a moment where theoretically you can say, this is this horrible thing that we're dealing with, but we need to come together as a country, and the more that we come together, the more we can beat it. Obviously, with Trump in the White House, the response in the US was the complete and utter opposite of that, to the point that everything from mask wearing to even mentioning the fact that COVID is still a problem has become polarized. So that's one thing. I think that's, weird to talk about something during a pandemic as a missed opportunity, but I think if we'd had a different president, maybe that would have led to at least a little bit of, or at least a momentary sense of togetherness. The other brief thing I mentioned when we talk about institutional reform is that this is year 2020, which means that redistricting is coming up. And so I think a lot of where the polarization we have this year comes from is the idea that we have a primary system in a largely, depending on your state, gerrymandered map that favors people knowing that this is a safe Republican seat or a safe Democratic seat. Oftentimes you choose the most radical candidate for that primary. They then go on to win a safe House seat. And then once those people get together in Congress, it's extremely difficult to find ways to work together. And so I think that depending on what happens this year, not just at the national level, but also in state legislatures across the country, who are the people who will redraw these maps, there is an opportunity to chip away at some of that is already sort of institutionally possible. It just depends very much on the right people being in those positions to do it.
Great, thanks for that. I think to shift a little bit, I think for me what's very interesting, especially at a conference like Anocracy, and we're talking about bold visions, working with the Democratic Party and Democrats abroad, and at the 2020 Democratic National Convention, a question I get a lot from my friends who are not really so involved in the Democratic Party is that the Democrats, they really need better vision. They don't have bold vision, and that there's nothing that's really inspiring a large array of voters to really come out for them. Do you agree with this statement? And if you do, what vision would actually be able to keep this large coalition going that's right now very unified against Donald Trump? But we need it because it's not just about Trump. There's a lot of systemic issues that we do need to address.
Yeah, I think if I had that bold vision, I'd have a great consultancy contract, right, with the with the party. So I have no idea what this bold vision could look like. But I think Emily has just pointed at that. One of the reasons why there hardly is a vision in a campaign, and that it's not only the case in 2020, that has also been the cases before, is due to institutional settings and circumstances, because you have to go through primaries, right? And in primaries, you have these more extremes. And then in the national, when it comes to the general election, you really have to make the effort to pull back to the middle again, right? And I think that's one of the issues. What the vision for the Democrats in, let's say, for the next 10, 20 years to come is up. I have. Emily, over to you. You're the native here.
I will admit, I also don't think that I necessarily have the answer on this front. I would mention one thing to your point about institutional reform. So the state of California, that both Diego and I are from, has since a few years now had kind of an interesting primary system, in that it's not party primaries, but the top 2 vote getters from any party move on to the general election. And so California is a very democratic state. There are areas where there's, no Republican would maybe have a chance in a House district. But the idea that, so then you have to have people competing among each other, yes, within the maybe democratic spectrum of values, but also with an eye toward being able to win in a general electorate that includes not just Democrats. I think it's an interesting idea. I don't know if it could work in every state, but I think it's interesting. And then as far as unifying, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just, actually, if I may, could I ask a question to the 2 Californians here?
Of course, sure. Conversation.
Yeah. Let's just think, because it is democracy, sort of thinking about democracy in the future. What would happen to California if Trump wins again? Is there, the Cal exit has been sort of, bubbling here and there. Is that something that could seriously happen?
Emily, do you want to start?
I will admit I haven't lived there in a while now, so perhaps I am missing the grassroots level of this. Not actually. I don't see that happening actually, but I do think talking about this sort of entrepreneurial spirit of, clearly the federal government is not giving us what we need, so we're going to do it for ourselves. California has already, and blue states generally have kind of been on that front this whole term, and I think you see that rapidly accelerate under a second Trump term, were that to be the case. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I do think, with the totally apocalyptic pictures of the skies over the Bay Area from the fires earlier this fall, there simply is not time to wait. I think it's very clear that California is the future of climate change, and not just, or it's already here in the present. It's not just in the future.
Yeah.
I think that something would have to change on that front.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on, I don't see California leaving the union. I do see more of a so people are recognizing actually some of the inequalities that California actually does face. And what do I mean by that? For example, we have 2 senators, each senator is representing 20 million people. That is not representation. That is more, I don't know what that is, but you can't represent 20 million people, right? And then at the same time, of course, as we all know, we have maybe a state like Wyoming and Montana with less than 1 million people, and each senator is representing 400,000 or 500,000. And of course, there's a larger conversation on representing smaller states' rights. But I think that issues like this are coming into people's consciousness who live in California, and they're saying, hey, this is not exactly fair. We don't necessarily want to take their rights away from our fellow Wyomingians or Montanians, but something probably should change because it's actually better for everyone. That's coming from maybe my perspective. I don't know if everyone following would think the same way, but yeah.
Thanks.
And Emily,
yeah, I mean,
point,
I think that if we want to, yeah, I was just going to say, if we want to talk about upsides of the Trump administration, I mean, I think we could all agree that there have been a lot of downsides to that, but you know, an upside would be that I think it has put in starker focus, whether through his actions, whether through issues like police violence, whether through the pandemic, it has put in extremely clear focus some of the long-term structural inequalities and problems that we have in the States. And so at the very least, there's a very clear laundry list of things that a new administration would need to work on. And we may not have all the answers for how that happens, but I think that's the one sort of overarching upside, is that it's the stakes have become extremely clear and there's a very long to-do list.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So to shift gears a little bit, because this very long to-do list scares me a little bit, to be honest. So let's move to maybe one thing we can concretely talk about. We got a question from the audience, specifically about, this is probably more towards Emily, but very happy to hear both of your opinions on this, your takes on this. And the question is about that there are states like Maine that use ranked voting, so ranked choice voting. Do you consider this to be a useful means for improving the representation of American democracy and also reducing toxic polarization?
Yeah, I think that's another great example of something that, again, it's tough because the States is such a massive country and states have typically run things in different ways for a long time. Part of what makes it so confusing on election night. But I do think that that's another very concrete example of something that Maine could consider doing. Totally.
Yeah. Andrea, do you have any takes on
No,
choice
I fully
voting?
agree with what Emily said.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe a quick take from my side. I think when I was a delegate to the 2020 National Convention, and I was actually elected using ranked choice voting. And that was a very unique example of Democrats abroad, which is equivalent to a state, using a new way of voting to try to make it more democratic and representative. And through learning this process, which was very confusing to be honest, we actually had two different types of ranked choice voting. At the end, actually, I did get this feeling of being more part of the community, and also it was overall way more representative. So I think there's a lot of way to experiment with these types of democratic systems at different levels, and it's about good exchange. We are actually coming to an end. I think I do have one last question. We are definitely in a unique situation. We have three people talking about the future of the United States. We all have a connection actually to California, but we all are sitting digitally in Berlin. So I think a question maybe on all of our minds to some extent is transatlantic relations and what's the future of that? So this is a very broad topic, maybe a bad question to really end with, but I would be really curious to hear a couple of your ideas as people who have really connections to both sides of the pond. And what do you think? Do you think people actually have more of a understanding of how important it is to be in a multilateral world after seeing what Trump and the damage he does really can do, the consequences of that? Or, yeah, what is the vision of transatlantic relations that you see between these two countries, United States and Germany?
I mean, Biden, if I can start, Emily,
Biden,
if Biden wins the presidency, he will for sure. We see multilateralism arising again, and we expect then his first sort of foreign visit actually to be to Europe. But I think Europe should also be clear about that the focus the U.S. has on the Pacific and on Asia probably will remain. But of course, relations to NATO, to WHO, and the list is long, will be rebuilt, and multilateralism will come back again. But it will take some time, no doubt.
Yeah, that's very much in line with what I've heard as well, is that, even if Biden is elected and goes back to the same kind of policies and role that the US used to have in the past, it doesn't erase what happened in the last 4 years. I mean, in terms of the importance of both the transatlantic relationship and sort of, multilateralism and international involvement more broadly. So one kind of concrete example, so Germany and the US did this sort of year of friendship, Wunderbar together, that was, I believe it was last year or the year before. And, I had friends who were involved in the planning of that, or at least talking about the planning of that. And a lot of their focus was on, okay, we need to be, if we're holding events, they shouldn't be in New York and DC. We need to be playing up, for example, talking about shared heritage, shared history, shared roots. I think it's hard for a lot of people, especially in a time when they are struggling with so many immediate problems, to impress upon them why a multilateral world is relevant to them. And so I think that's, regardless of who wins in this election, there are, of course, Americans who pay attention to that and believe in that. But I think there's a lot of people who are probably going to need to be convinced, why it is relevant to them and why it is helpful for the country. And that's the challenge in any country, right? About, trying to get people interested in their role, their country's role abroad. But in the States, especially because everything happening at home has been so all-consuming these last 4 years, I think that'll be a new and hopefully exciting challenge going forward.
On that note, Andrea, Emily, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Of course, it was a pleasure.
Thanks for the discussion.
Yeah. Democracy 2021, hopefully in person, hopefully under a different administration, and with some bold visions for how we're moving forward all together. So thank you also to all the participants who tuned in. One quick note, if you are listening on Zoom, please make sure that you fill out the evaluation form. We would love to hear from you as well. And with that, up next, we have Paulina Fröhlich and Judith Silla, who will be discussing the past 3 days at Democracy. Have a great night, everyone.